But what did Jesus have in mind when he invoked the kingdom of heaven? I think with these two parables, Jesus tells us quite a bit about the kingdom of heaven as he understood it. First thing he tells us is that the kingdom of heaven is not a thing of the future, at least not exclusively of the future, at least in part a matter of our present. It is fomenting, germinating, sprouting in the here and now, even if we can't obviously detect it. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It may have a future of great substance, but that future is born of the invisible germination in our present. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast, he says, hidden inside a lot of dough. One day it'll be loaves of bread for plenty. But in the present, it's working to grow that future. And this notion that the kingdom is active in our present, like germinating seed or fermenting yeast, stands in contrast to notions of the kingdom that only look to the future. A conception of God's kingdom that is only in the future may encourage us actually to devalue the present. And as a consequence, some Christians don't put any value in this present life. If the kingdom of heaven is only somewhere we will arrive in the future, then maybe the only thing we need to do in this life is hunker down and wait for Jesus, putting our head between our knees and waiting for him to come get us. Sometimes Christians who think God's kingdom is only about the future then conclude that this world isn't all that valuable and therefore not really worth protecting, and then say ecological responsibility is deemed misplaced because this present isn't of any value. The thing to wait for and pine for is the future that God promises us. But by using the mustard seed and the yeast as examples, Jesus suggests that the kingdom is something that may be big and awesome in the future, but it begins now, in our midst. It's part of our present, even if we can't see it moving or working. It's here. And so we ought to look for the signs. The second point Jesus makes about the kingdom of heaven in these parables is that we should expect the kingdom to emerge from the smallest, most unassuming source material. This isn't the only place in the Gospels where Jesus uses a mustard seed to symbolize something very tiny from which great things grow. The mustard seed may not have been the smallest seed in the ancient Middle East, but it was a common symbol for things tiny and unassuming. And Jesus says the kingdom of heaven will come from something as tiny and unassuming as this. Similarly, we all know that yeast is small, but it produces the means from which something large and sustaining will grow. But what's interesting to me here is that smallness may not be the only thing that Jesus was trying to capture when he used yeast in a parable about the kingdom. When we think of yeast today, we probably think about clean packets of dry yeast that we fold into dough to make bread. But reference to yeast in the ancient world wasn't to inoffensive packets bought at the Giant. In the ancient world, bread was made by adding a starter to flour. And that starter came in the form of an old, sometimes moldy piece of dough that probably smelled pretty gross. That disgusting thing was then folded into new dough to give it rise. To say that the kingdom of heaven was like yeast was to imply that God's kingdom would one day come from something not only small, but also maybe something not terribly attractive. Did Jesus mean to intend this meaning? Hard to say for sure, but I like to think he did. Because if he simply meant to say that the kingdom grows from something small to big, He might have used some other image, like another seed, perhaps. It also would have made this second parable pretty redundant with the first. I like to think that Jesus did mean for the people in his audience to say, that's gross, when he compared the start of God's kingdom with yeast. I'd like to think that Jesus meant for us to consider that the seeds of God's kingdom often reside not just or even primarily in the things grand, flashy, or gold-plated, but in things and in people who represent the underside of the world that many of us would consider unattractive. People just making vital contributions to goodness from within the muck that is often life in this world every day. Author and Episcopal priest Heidi Haverkamp recently wrote, "The kingdom of God grows and mushrooms from what may seem like the stinky gunk of our own lives. But things aren't stinky because they are dead. They're stinky because they are alive and growing. If that's how the kingdom of heaven is, how might we look differently at everyday life with its pain, disappointments, and frustrations? What if these things are a funky gunk like sourdough starter or compost, not something to be eliminated, avoided, or neutralized, but food to help new life grow in us?" What would be some examples of things tiny and sometimes maybe not the most attractive from which God's kingdom could grow? I have an example in mind, but I'll save it for a minute. In the meantime, a third point about God's kingdom that Jesus makes with these parables. From these small, unassuming, and at times unattractive origins shall grow a kingdom that is impressive and expansive and generous. But precisely because it is so expansive, it may be off-putting to some. Obviously, a major point of both of these parables is to emphasize to us that the kingdom of heaven finds its starting place in little things, but grows to be great. The mustard seed is tiny, but the mustard tree, if it's not the largest tree in the Middle East, it's a formidable shrub. The yeast in Jesus' parable is mixed with 3 measures of flour, but that's not 3 cups. 3 measures in Jesus' time was about 50 pounds of flour. And so this little bit of yeast becomes bread enough for 100 people. From something relatively small comes something great. But there may be some other layers of hidden code in these short parables that add some dimension to the greatness Jesus is predicting. Some biblical scholars think that Jesus' reference to birds finding refuge in the branches of the mustard shrub is a callback to prophecies from the Old Testament books of Daniel and Ezekiel, in which birds were a symbol of the Gentiles. Those prophecies were foreshadowing a time when God's promises to Israel to be their God and shower them with steadfast love, that those promises to Israel would be extended to all the people of the world, which is, of course, what we Christians believe happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so those birds in the branches of Jesus' mustard tree may have been a subtle sign that we should expect that from these little seeds, a kingdom in which all are welcome would be grown. All can find refuge in God's wide embrace. There's something else that's curious about that parable of the mustard seed. Why pick that plant? Sure, the mustard seed is small, but it's not the only tiny seed out there. And the mustard seed is big for a shrub. It grows to about my height or so, which is a pretty good accomplishment when you start out as a seed that tiny. But if Jesus really wanted to make the point that the kingdom of God would be impressive, he should have focused on, say, a cypress tree, which is a giant tree. But I like to think that Jesus had another agenda here, too. The contrast between the mustard seed and the tree it bore was great enough to make his point that from small things will come a great kingdom. But the mustard tree brings more to the table. As a metaphor, truth be told, the mustard seed was a glorified weed in the ancient world. It was everywhere. It was invasive. And it was at times annoying because of that. Like those fake ladybugs that somebody got the bright idea to introduce to eat aphids and now gather in the corners of my house every fall. But this too may have been intentional on Jesus' part. If subtle, Jesus may have chosen the mustard tree in part to say, yeah, the kingdom will be big and it will be expansive, but it will also be, because of that, annoying to some people in the world, precisely because of its sprawl. God's kingdom grows without us knowing, until its ethic of wide embrace ends up an invasive species in our otherwise unfriendly and dehumanizing world. It will be subversive, ending up in places no one expected or intended, and turning over what the dominant culture has been trying to sow and spread. The kingdom of God will fester and grow and eventually choke out all that compete with it for space. Oh, that it may be. If the kingdom grows as uninhibited as a mustard tree, if it grows as uninhibited as the burdock or the wild parsnip around my yard back in Vermont, then we are in for a revolution of love and grace. It will take over our gardens and our fields. God willing, it will take over our hearts and our minds and our lives and our communities. That master teacher Jesus packs so much meaning in these two tiny parables. Even the parables themselves, all of 2 verses, represent the tiny potential from which God's reign will emerge. I promised you an example a few minutes ago. As I was pondering these parables this week, I was struck by the realization that we have an example of their promise in our midst this very week. Looking for something tiny and somewhat gross from which God's kingdom might grow? Then look no further than the kids who will be running around the halls of this building during the evenings of Vacation Bible School this week. Our children are the seeds of God's kingdom. They start tiny, and if you think they're not sometimes gross as moldy bread or annoying as weed, then you haven't been around small children very much. But from these unassuming seeds can grow God's reign of love and grace if we plant them carefully. From this unsophisticated starter can grow in abundance if we prepare it carefully. And that's the point of Vacation Bible School. The investment that we as a church make in our children fits the message of these parables to a T. Want to know how to make the kingdom of God more visible on earth? A kingdom of justice and love and community? Well, teach our children those things. Teach them in a way that counters the other lessons that they are learning in our world. That the best man always wins. That survival of the fittest is the law of human nature. That God helps those who help themselves. That the market determines what has value. That might makes right and weakness is pathetic. We nurture the kingdom into existence when we teach our children that there are only 2 basic rules to right living. Love the Lord your God with your whole selves and love your neighbor as yourself. We prepare the kingdom for rising when we teach our children that there's only one way to be great and that is to see Jesus in the hungry person we give food, or the vulnerable person we give clothing and shelter, or the stranger that we show genuine welcome. We help God grow the kingdom when we teach our children that God doesn't bless those who help themselves and only themselves, but those who do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with their God. Teach our kids these things, and we will be planting the seed for a generation that will produce a righteous weed that will choke out all the noxious fruit we have sowed in this sinful generation. Our kids are our leaven. They give rise to our hope for the future. Want to see tiny hints of the kingdom of God? Swing by the church one night this week. Bree and her team will be making bread and sowing a garden. Amen.